When John first mentioned to me the general theme for this seminar series, the idea of the commons, as he called it, I must admit my first impulse was that I should probably talk to you about law and economics of deep seabed under the law of the sea convention, but then I thought the better of it, and so what I decided I would do was talk to you about a scandal. Two of them, in fact. One triggered by international law's treatment of the phenomenon of universality and what Carl Schmitt's concept of the political can tell us about it. The other triggered by Louis Althusser's reading of Feuerbach and what his critique of Feuerbach's theories can tell us about the general disciplinary predicament of the international law profession, broadly so conceived. In between these two scandals will lurk my main thesis, and a story that I would like to think is a story about the RUSES of the international law reason. Let me start that story by saying this. If the basic claim I am going to make in this paper is correct, then the question that I want to pose to you, to put it everywhere on the proverbial table right from the outset, is how does it make you feel to be an international lawyer? How does it make you feel to be part of the international law project? Are you happy with doing what you do? Are you happy with being who you are and what you are? As I understand my paper, this is the basic question that will logically arise at the end of this presentation. I decided, however, that I would flag it up for you in advance so that we know, as Duncan Kennedy might say, what are the stakes of the conversation before we engage in it. How does it make you feel to be a part of the international law project? Or, for the more Marxistically minded amongst you, what is to be done? Or to quote the eponymous essay, and if we judge people not by the glittering uniforms they don, nor by the high-sounding appellations they give themselves, but by their actions, and by what they actually advocate. What kind of quarrels must we pick? And what kind of tactics must we plan? I don't claim I'll be able to give you an intellectual or even morally satisfactory answer to any of these questions. But as Heidegger might have said, sometimes raising an interesting question can be more useful than finding an answer to it. Let's hope he wasn't entirely wrong. And so to begin, international law and universality, a tale of two scandals. Every thesis, they say, has its own time and its own place, its own conjuncture, by which it is shaped and from which it takes its original impulse. The immediate conjuncture that generated this paper began when I first came across that curious, strange document adopted by the UN General Assembly called the United Nations Millennium Declaration. The main idea that captured my imagination when I first read that document came in the very first opening passages. It was the idea that, as the drafters put it, not only were the basic purposes and principles of the UN Charter timeless and universal, but that also, if only we were able somehow to extrapolate from these principles a larger network of international legal regimes, we would thereby quite certainly advance towards a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world order. Now, what struck me the most about this line of argument was not so much its openly Kelsenian overtones, what with this whole Grindormist mentality, but the general set of assumptions behind it. How could one ever take seriously the idea that a set of normative provisions negotiated by the representatives of the four victorious allies at the end of World War II could ever end up becoming timeless and universal? And yet this assumption, if you think about it carefully, is not at all that unusual in the context of contemporary international law discourse. Indeed, one could say it has been one of the most characteristic traits of the contemporary international law project, at least over the course of the last half-century, to insist at every suitable opportunity that the quest for the realization of timeless and universal values is the ultimate reason and goal of everything done under the rubric of what we might call the enterprise of international law. Universality, if you will, has become in this sense both the ultimate cause and the ultimate end of international law. No idea of a similar stature has reached the same position of centrality in contemporary international law discourse, nor does it seem that any could. One can think international law without using the categories of statehood, territory, national sovereignty, even war and adjudication. But one cannot even begin to imagine the idea of international law without including in it a reference in one way or another to the notion of universality. The relationship between international and universality, one might say, in this sense has become the definitive reference point the supreme master signifier around which the whole game of international legal thinking is structured. To the disciplinary insiders, the received understanding of this relationship explains both the ultimate reason and the ultimate promise of their discipline and professional life projects. To the disciplinary outsiders, it serves as the principal category in terms of which they conceptualize the whole idea of international law. Few concepts have ever enjoyed this kind of self-evident relationship of mutual entailment with the idea of international law as an enterprise and a body of knowledge. In contemplating universality, one might say international law has thus, in effect, come to contemplate itself. And at least in its own eyes, in contemplating itself, it has come to seek the keys to the meaning of universality. And yet, what do we actually speak about when we speak about universality as international lawyers? A couple of years ago, a friend of mine from one of the London colleges invited me to take a part in a small conference she was organizing on the subject of international legal theory. The general theme of the event, she said, was to tease out a vision of international law as a means and a process of, as she put it, securing our common humanity. The idea, in other words, of how the one could be used to advance the other. The social project, the overarching goal, the discipline, the aspiration. I may not be reporting the language she used very accurately, but that was essentially the basic sense I had got from that conversation, and my first reaction to it at the time, I remember, was that it all sounded very much like something straight out of Philip Allen. It had been by then quite some time since I had last read anything by Philip Allen, and so some of the finer details of his argument seemed a bit hazy, but what I could remember seemed certainly relevant enough to convince me that if I wanted to look at the idea of international law's place in securing our common humanity, then my first point of call, reading-wise, would have to be Allen's writings. For good or ill, I did not at the time own a copy of Eunomia, the volume which most international lawyers usually regard as Allen's definitive work on international legal theory, but I did have with me a copy of The Health of Nations, a more recent monograph he wrote on the same subject, and so I decided I would start on that instead. What I discovered by the end of the second day of rereading it was nothing short of a revelation. First, to my rather considerable personal embarrassment, I realized that I had in fact completely misjudged Professor Allen's place and status in the context of the broader discursive conjuncture of the contemporary international law profession. In my defense, it wasn't probably entirely my fault. Given his own self-presentation, very few students of international law would normally regard Professor Allen as anything but an outstanding eccentric. This is, after all, somebody whose writings tend to discuss international law in terms of a species memory, and who opens one of his monographs on international law with a discussion of Parmenides. But one should not, of course, rely only on first impressions. And that, I suppose, was the main lesson I learned that day from The Health of Nations. No doubt, the language Allen uses in that book is idiosyncratic and often quite mystifying. But the conceptual framework which he creates with it, the theoretical constructs he formulates on its basis, the tropes he uses to articulate his arguments, are not. All its linguistic eccentricities aside, the theorization which Allen offers in The Health of Nations of the basic idea of international law, and in particular its relationship to the politics of universality, provides to my mind one of the most faithful representations of that general matrix of latent assumptions that one might call the official ideology of the contemporary international law project, or to use one of Althusser's favorite labels, its spontaneous philosophy. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. What is the basic gist of Allen's theory of international law? I'm looking at the first passage from the handout. Law forms part of the self-constituting of a society. International society is the collective self-constituting of all human beings, the society of all societies. International law is the self-constituting of all humanity through law. It is the actualizing through law of the common interest of international society, the society of all societies. Now, the idea of constitution that lies at the heart of the quoted passage, traditionally so understood, purports to my mind to describe what is essentially always an unavoidably political act. To constitute means to establish a new entity in the arena of political action. The arena, in other words, in which one typically encounters practices related to the distribution of power and wealth across a particular social surface, and the corresponding contestations concerning the use and control of various institutions and structures of government. The activity of constituting, as every student of public law knows, by its very definition, is an essential political activity. To define international law, as Alec suggests one should do, in terms of its constituting function, then, is effectively tantamount to constructing it, first and foremost, as an essential political enterprise. An enterprise, in other words, which has at its core the questions of distribution, empowerment, disempowerment, and social control. As he puts it in a different passage in the same text, law is what makes the public realm. Law is always a delegation of power. What kind of power are we talking about in the case of international law? Put differently, if international law should indeed be a political enterprise, what kind of political vision would characterize the social reality of this enterprise? Now, whatever else it may mean otherwise, the concept of the all-humanity that Alec introduces in the second excerpt is an essential universalistic, all-inclusive concept. It reflects what is meant to be a synonym for the whole totality of the human race, taken as a single ontological entity. Put differently, being an expression of the self-constitution of the whole humanity, international law for Alec must be understood thus as essentially an enterprise, the principal object of which should be the self-establishment of the full totality of the human species as a single political entity. Or in other words, an expressive political project aimed at securing the realization of the full totality of the human species as a subject of power and welfare relations. That is to say, a subject whose interests require advancement, entrenchment, and if need be, vigorous protection. So far, so clear. But then we come to the next theoretical stop. Common interest is a society's self-interest. A self-interest which may conflict with the self-interest of society members in their capacity as individual human beings. Common interest is not merely an aggregation of particular interests. It is an idea of society's enlightened self-interest. Now, just what exactly is this supposed to mean? The interest of the whole humanity, Alex seems to be suggesting in this passage, can easily and quite routinely come into conflict with the interests of its individual members. The pursuit of the interests of the whole humanity, in other words, not only may not actually benefit every individual human being, but may also, in fact, actually lead to openly detrimental results for many of them. All that is perfectly fine, however. For, as Alec observes, common interest is a product of the society's enlightened self-reflection, not a mechanically derived sum total of the particular interests of each of its components. Just what is this supposed to mean? What is going on here? Quite evidently, for Alec, there seems to exist a fundamental ontological gap between the order of the whole humanity, for the sake of whose well-being international law exists as a political enterprise, and its individual members. The only way in which this gap can be bridged, furthermore, is through an enlightened deliberation by the society. Question invites itself to be asked at this point. If the main defining feature of international law as a concept comes from its profoundly political nature, does it not follow from this, by logical implication, that the main defining feature of this fundamental ontological gap between the order of the whole humanity and the order of its individual members must also be that it is profoundly political? Does it not follow, in other words, that the conflict between the common interests of the whole humanity and those of its individual members is an essential political conflict? That is to say, a conflict involving a disagreement about the distribution of power and welfare. And if that is true, if our theory, in other words, has to admit that within the folds of the social entity, whose very conception implies the condition of full human universality, there may exist an uneraseable room for conflict, contestation, and political rivalry, the immediate wording may not be exactly identical, but scratch the verbal surface, and what you find underneath it, I think, is the unmistakable shadow of Carl Schmitt. At its root, the concept of the political, for Schmitt, represents a state of being which occurs essentially between a friend and an enemy. For a political project of any kind to become conceivable, The corresponding social space thus has to be structurally separated into two foundational antagonistic camps, the members of each of which will experience one another as friends, and the members of the opposite camps as enemies. Without this condition, there can be no political environment and thus no room for a political enterprise of any kind. Now, on some level, this argument may come across as a rather startling premonition of Lévi-Straussian binarism and the whole tradition of French structuralism which followed from it. But its real power as an analytical instrument has an essentially different functionality. It comes from its insight into the logic of identitarian socio-psychological processes, rather than the formal logical construction of the ontologic space. As Schmidt himself repeatedly points out, in ontological terms, the concepts friend and enemy do not represent any pre-given essences. Rather, the two constructs ought to be regarded more as objects' effects, produced by the dialectic of their mutually constitutive action. Put differently, Schmidt's basic thesis here seems to be that for any experience of an essentially political nature, however banal or refined, to become possible, there has to emerge first a certain sense of a relationally constructed social collectivity, whose basic sense of self-identity must be completed through its continuous counterposing itself against its identitarian social outside, the antagonistic other, which regularly shares its social space and vis-a-vis which it experiences itself not only as fundamentally dissimilar, but also as ontologically incommensurate. That is to say, which it regards as a representation of a social category in which it could never be subsumed, and by the boundaries of which it must thus always remain delimited and defined. Seen against this background, the idea of humanity, remarks Schmidt, cannot ever have a political coloration, since in purely material terms, humanity has no social outside. The very idea of there being a political entity, observes Schmidt, presupposes the real existence of an enemy, and therefore a certain kind of coexistence with another political entity. Taken as such, the concept of humanity, however, excludes the concept of the enemy, because the enemy does not cease to be a human being, and hence there is no special differentiation in that concept. Put to practice, what all these observations suggest should not be that difficult to work out. Writes Schmidt again, that wars are waged in the name of humanity has an especially intensive political meaning. When a state fights its political enemy in the name of humanity, it is not a war for the sake of humanity that we witness unfolding, but only a war wherein a particular state seeks to usurp a universal concept against its military opponents. At the expense of its opponent, it tries to identify itself with humanity in the same way as one can misuse peace, justice, progress, and civilization in order to claim these as one's own and to deny the same to the enemy. Whenever a political project is proclaimed in the name of humanity, it follows then, it is not the politics of securing our common human condition that we observe, but a viciously devious usurpation of what otherwise is a completely apolitical idea. Devious because, as Schmidt points out again, to confiscate the word humanity, to invoke and monopolize such a term, probably has certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity. And a politics led on such terms is thereby driven to the most extreme forms of inhumanity. There doesn't seem to be much to say at this point about what Schmidt's observations tell us about Al's account of international law, except to remind ourselves that despite its author's general reputation as an archetypal eccentric, it reflects, in fact, a tremendously widespread consensus whose traces one can uncover in every corner of the contemporary mainstream international law practice. One can uncover it in every dimension of international criminal law and the law of environmental protection, in the law of territory and the law of the sea, in deduction of sources, and in the law of anti-colonialism. It underwrites the whole system of global criminal justice, especially as exemplified in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And it pervades the law of treaties and treaty reservations. It carries on its shoulders the doctrine of ergo omnes and the whole debate about international law constitutionalism. Consider, the party in the name of which the ICC purports to dispense justice is in all but its name a direct manifestation of the allotting concept of the old humanity. The opposing party, the prosecutee, even before the advent of the court, had traditionally been known as nothing other than the enemy of the mankind, hostis humanis generis. I'm not even going to get into the whole debate about the symbolical meaning of crimes against humanity. In a similar vein, the whole logic of the infamous reservations to the Genocide Convention decision rendered by the International Court of Justice more than 6 decades ago, seen from this angle, seems by a startling premonition of the Lawton claim that the common interest of the whole humanity is not substantively equal to the sum total of the individual interests of its various elements. The presumption which the court inaugurated on that occasion, the presumption that because humanitarian treaties exist to protect the interests of the whole human race, participation in them should not be threatened by any parochial gains typically expected of sovereign states, has carried, of course, through the years, not only into the work of the European Court of Human Rights, as evidenced in the landmark Bolalos judgment, or the institutional practices of the UN Human Rights Committee, as evidenced in its General Comment number 2452, but also into the broader customary understanding of adoption of sources, as evidenced by the rise of the so-called new customary law of human rights, or what Frederick Kirgus somewhat more teasingly described under the rubric of the sliding scale of custom. Moving from the field of international normative constructs to the doctrinal writings, the same basic conception and the same attitude towards the general relationship between law and universality can also be uncovered in countless works of doctrinal scholarship, Western and non-Western, conservative and progressive alike. Bruno Sima, Christopher Viramantri, Rosalind Higgins, Onuma Yatsuaki, Rain Mullerson, Mohammed Bajau, Emmanuel Jouanet, Christian Tomashat. The list can go on. But the basic point should be evident. The argument here is not that everyone in the mainstream tradition thinks in the shadow of the locality. The argument is that what we have seen with Ella is the mainstream tradition. Now, Schmidt, of course, himself had produced quite a substantial body of writing about international law, but my contention today would be that the most accomplished Schmidtian account of international law we can find today does not actually come from Schmidt himself, but rather can be found in the works of Anthony Anghie. In particular, his seminal essay published in the 1999 Harvard International Law Journal, Finding Peripheries, and he subsequently released magnum opus called Imperialism, Sovereignty, and International Law. And I realized I didn't include excerpts from Anghie in the handout. I apologize. My broad argument, writes Anghie, is that colonialism has always been central to the constitution of international law. Many of the basic doctrines of international law were forged out of the attempt to create a legal system that would account for relations between the European and non-European worlds in the context of colonial confrontation. Once posited, they created a set of structures that continually repeated themselves at various stages in the history of international law, and that still continue to operate in contemporary international law to retard the Third World's attempts to reverse the effects of colonialism. Now, one way to read this passage would be by concluding that for Anghie, the modern-day enterprise of international law as we know it was shaped fundamentally by the historical experience of European colonialism. That colonialism, in this sense, was a fundamental precondition of the contemporary international legal system, and its legacies in many cases are still with us and have not been fully eliminated. Although it certainly would not be incorrect, I don't think this interpretation actually captures the full import of Anghie's argument. The colonial character of international law, which Anghie tries to flesh out in his work, has to be understood not simply in terms of international law's external relationship to the historical reality of the colonial conquest, but also in terms of its deeply intimate connection with the colonialist ideology of the civilizing mission. Contrary to the common assumption, writes Anghie, the central dilemma which has defined the evolution of the international law discipline in the last 150 years has not been how can order exist between sovereigns, but rather how can order exist among entities characterized as belonging to entirely different cultural systems. Put differently, the basic operative assumption that historically laid the origins of the modern project of international law was that fundamental cultural differences divided the European and non-European worlds. These differences were not simply a matter of historical fact, but also carried with them certain inevitable normative implications. The greatest of these implications was the inevitability of the institution of a dichotomy between the civilized and the uncivilized worlds. The implicit proviso which underwrote this dichotomy was that, firstly, it had to be bridged, and secondly, it had to be bridged in favor of the civilized world. the whole history of international law, thus, observes Andy, invites itself to be understood in terms of what might be termed the dynamic of difference. Jurists, using the conceptual tools of legal theory, postulate a gap, understood principally in terms of cultural differences between the civilized European and the uncivilized non-European world. Having established this gap, they then proceeded to devise a series of techniques for bridging this gap, for civilizing the uncivilized. Although formally the idea of the civilizing mission was unconditionally discarded and banished from the surface of international law many years ago, the dynamic of difference which it has inspired turned out to be remarkably resilient. Not only self-sustaining, but in fact, untranscendable. As Andy puts it, each act of arrival revealed further horizons. Each act of bridging created further differences which international law then sought to overcome. What is more, the very concepts through which these differences have been historically articulated never remained neutral or politically innocent. On the contrary, they were all profoundly racialized and contained within them traces of discrimination. Whenever this racialism was fleshed out and the resulting conceptual structures delegitimized as intellectually spurious, new structures were immediately erected, creating the same dichotomy between the civilized and the uncivilized, and thus recalling the same racialist dynamic. Looking back at the history of the discipline, the greatest tragedy which befell the anti-colonialist movement, concludes Andy, could be made sense in precisely these terms. The mechanisms used by international law to achieve decolonization were the mechanisms that created neocolonialism. So where does it leave international as a project, asks Andy? Where does it leave the enterprise of international legal theory? The first step, he says, is to accept the inevitability of international law's universality. Notice, however, what kind of universality Andy speaks about. International law is a body of law which applies to all states. The universality of application marks the universality for dimension. International has become a universal construct insofar as its prescriptions have become the same for everyone. But whatever happened to the idea of the universality by and the universality of? The universality of international law's generation, where these prescriptions come from, and the universality of its representability, whose ideas do these prescriptions reflect? One will not find a direct answer to these questions anywhere in Andy's writings, but it is not difficult to surmise which way his position leans. As his discussion of the idea of the dynamics of difference makes it clear, for Andy, it is not just the case that colonialism has been somehow pervasive as a matter of historical trend, that the reform in favor of progressive decolonization was resisted, and at every point, colonialism rebuilt itself through new techniques. The point, rather, is much more fundamental. It is a matter of international law's very design, its very structure as a social phenomenon, that it must inevitably resolve itself into colonialism. Writes Andy, in its necessarily endless drive towards universality, international law has been always based on the compelling invocation of the civilizational other. The drive is necessarily endless, because even while seeking to create a universal system, it generates the very kind of difference which makes this task impossible. I suggest we break quickly for a couple of minutes before I move to the rest of the paper.
All right, so why don't we take 5 minutes and then I guess we're going to go to the next section. Okay, so 5-minute break.
Para mí es un hombre que habla a sí mismo. A ratos parecen. ¿Cómo? Ratos a veces.
A veces parece. Pero en realidad o sea, se nota que al menos entiende lo que está hablando.
Sí, claro, pero tú entiendes.
Significa mi attention span.
Claro.
Pero, bueno, es lo más interesante.
Pero el vídeo es registrado todo. El vídeo es registrado como nuestro. El vídeo está aquí a tu derecho.
Pueden deberían darle el video.
Saludos a mi papá, mi sobrino, mi caminado. Chao a
Y a ver, ahí te van a ver
Realmente quiero descansar en el tren, no puedo dormir, ni siquiera puedo dormir en mi cama, pero por lo menos descanso para después tener un poco más de esfuerzo.
no entendí, me parece interesante también hasta que la
Igual lo está pasando, pero me estoy repitiendo. Estar ahorita en el líder, pero ahorita sí tenemos mi mamá, toda mi familia, la gente que no me conoce,
no es como que van a colocar paredes.
All right, so we're gonna start round 2. Yeah, in like 10 seconds or so. Give it 1 second. Okay.
7, 6, 5, 4. Okay. I won't dwell on the obvious parallels between Schmidt and Andy. I think I crossed into the territory more than I had to. Thank you. What I am going to do instead is take you back one more time to Allen. Looking at the third excerpt from Allen. Consider Allen's position on the question of international colonial origins. Allen's alternative to Angie does not begin with a denial of the historical factuality of the colonial experience. The colonial encounter, as Angie reports it, is in many ways as important to Allen's diagnosis of the contemporary international law project as it is to Angie's. Colonial oppression, slavery, genocide, These were the acts of the greatest social evil, remarks Allen, ever committed in the name of the public interest. Most of these acts, furthermore, have taken place under the aegis of international law. The common political project of which we, as the members of the international law profession today, are an integral part, is an outgrowth of that terrible political order which gave roof and support to these atrocities. As human beings and unwitting beneficiaries of it, we may now only feel shame and remorse. But we cannot take any responsibility for it. We, that is to say, the international law project which has grown out of this past, cannot be brought to judgment on those grounds. The past is past. It is beyond redemption. And the best we as international lawyers can do today is to promise not to repeat these greatest social evils if we have a chance. Nothing more can or should be expected of us. Pause for a second and ask yourself not whether you agree with Al's argument, but what sort of unspoken assumptions about the nature of the international law enterprise must be put in the background of this argument to give it a sense of internal coherence and make it meaningful. Think again. In the past, international law lent itself to justifying colonial oppression and genocide. That act was an undeniable evil. In the present, the international law profession, however, should not consider itself an accomplice of that evil act. What it should do instead is make sure to protect international law's future against its return. Now, the basic point I want to make here is that the only way for this line of reasoning to work, the only way for it to become meaningful at all, is if we first make the assumption that the history of colonialism was not in any way an integral, logical part of the actual enterprise of international law. That the real, authentic essence of that enterprise has nothing to do with colonial oppression, even though it did, in fact, contribute to its occurrence. Put differently, the underlying assumption here seems to be that however non-universal the modern international law project may have been in its historical origins, however tainted it may be by its past contributions to colonialism, genocide, and global apartheid, however non-universal and parochial its substantive conduct may be still today, somehow, through some hidden mechanism, this project can still, miraculously, rise above all of this and transform itself into the constitution of the all humanity, a genuine representation of full universality, the universality for as well as the universality of and by, because ultimately that is what constitutes its real, true, authentic essence. Now, if we look closely at the schematic plot structure which this argument implies, I think what we're going to notice is that first, to the extent to which Al's conception of international law is indeed an accurate representation of the dominant dogma which characterizes the mainstream international law tradition, this dogma boasts, in fact, a rather impressive philosophical pedigree. And second, the fundamental philosophical model on which this dogma is based is essentially derived from the Feuerbachian philosophy of human alienation. Consider once more the basic logic behind the assumption I have just summarized. The true, authentic essence of international law is that it is a universal legal system. Universal in the meaning of by, for, and certainly of. The practical realization of the international law project in history, however, has been colored with all kinds of divisions, parochial policies, colonial oppression. How must the community of international lawyers react to this discrepancy between international law's ideal essence and its practical realization? The answer, which the mainstream tradition, as exemplified in Al's treatment of the subject, gives to this question, I argue, looks virtually indistinguishable from the answer which Feuerbach gives to the question of the human potential. God, says Feuerbach in The Essence of Christianity, represents essentially the product of human spiritual alienation. All those great attributes which the human mind traditionally ascribes to God, infinity, almightiness, virtue, perfection, are in reality part and parcel of our own human essence, what Feuerbach calls the human species. We ascribe them to God because of some basic mistake, a delusion, if you will. We end up disuniting ourselves as a result from our better, more perfect parts, creating in the process a false sense of distance between what we understand to be our own condition and what we imagine, incorrectly, to be an ontologically different entity called God. This enforced separation, explains Feuerbach, comprises the ultimate reason behind every actual discrepancy between the rationality and virtuousness of our essence and the irrationality and imperfection of our actual existence. So how should we react to this fact now that we know about it? Feuerbach's answer is, first, celebrate. Second, turn to reason. Celebrate because even though our existence may be completely irrational, full of failings, and utterly inauthentic vis-a-vis our true essence, our basic human species, in other words, this irrationality, in the end, is only a transitory stage on the road to the ultimate realization of our authentic nature. The gap between existence and essence can be overcome, bridged, and transcended. For indeed, observes Feuerbach, the very fact that this gap exists is ultimately the surest guarantee of its inevitable transcendability. If perfection had not been attainable, why would have perfection been experienced as imperfection in the first place? But how does this movement from the inauthentic, imperfect existence to the authentic, perfect essence occur? Feuerbach's answer is by the cultivation of reason, enlightenment, and understanding. Why reason? Why enlightenment? Why understanding? What is the ontological status of all these phenomena in the Feuerbachian worldview? In a nutshell, and this is a rather radical simplification, for Feuerbach, these are all inherent features characteristic of the true human essence buried inside our souls, in the same way in which a kernel of gold is buried in the thickness of dross. We draw on them to help the rest of our essence to fight its way out against the irrationality of our existence. Put differently, we move from the imperfect and inauthentic realization of our almighty essential nature to the perfect authentic one by allowing the originatory potential of that essential nature to work itself out. Compare this now with the basic line around which the mainstream international legal tradition builds its approach to the subject of international law's universality. The authentic essence of international law is that it is a truly universal legal system. The actual reality of international law's historical record, however, shows a clear pattern of various kinds of finite parochialisms: hegemonic domination, racism, global exclusion, colonial oppression, and so on. How should international lawyers feel about this fact? What should their reaction be? The answer is, they should fully recognize the reality of this parochial inauthenticity. And Alec does this in an unflinchingly courageous way. But they should also then insist on its utter non-essentiality, or in other words, its causal non-centrality, vis-a-vis the broader structure of the international law project as an enterprise and a discipline. Rather than despair in the face of all the horror of international law's past and present injustices, rather than condemn and denounce that very project which they are serving for all the oppression and iniquity which it has brought, international lawyers, teaches the mainstream tradition, should summarily absolve themselves of any sense of responsibility for it and begin to rejoice in the anticipation of the gradual transcendence of all this iniquity. They must rejoice because it is not ultimately their responsibility that the reality of international law has been so dark, bleak, and bloody. The existence of the international legal project simply has not realized its authentic essence yet. But that realization, of course, will come. Sooner or later, international law will become the self-constitution of the whole humanity. The international legal order will become a securing of our common human condition. How do we know that? Because we know what the ultimate essence of the international law project is. And we know how it can be realized in practice. We should concentrate on the enlightened understanding of the common interests of the international society, and that in itself will release the universalistic promise of the international law project from all the obstructions imposed on it by its history. The parallels are quite difficult to miss. where Feuerbach speaks of the self-inflicted alienation of the human spirit, the mainstream tradition speaks of international law's unrealized potential for universality. Where Feuerbach speaks of the divine human essence transcending its own alienation by realizing its authentic potential for infinity, the mainstream tradition speaks of the vindication of international law's universalist promise, brought by the self-realization of legal universality secured by an intense self-reform of the international legal project. The tags and labels are different, but the underlying logic and landscape of ideas are exactly the same. Now, I do not know what you think about Feuerbach. Personally, I think his thesis of idealism is flawed, but that is beside the point. I'm not interested on this occasion in discussing what Feuerbach may or may not have got wrong. What I am interested in, rather, is discussing the basic ideological bias of his philosophy. Or to be more precise, the general ideological implications of transposing the theoretical framework on which it is based into the context of the international law project. The underlying assumption which guides me here is a rather old-fashioned one. It is basically that every philosophical model has a certain ideological functionality, in the sense that it tends to legitimize some political visions more consistently than others, if only by obfuscating the urgency of some political issues more readily than others. Over time, such functionalities inevitably change, to be sure, but within the limits of the same mode of production, they tend to remain, by and large, essentially the same. As a result, it usually becomes possible, over a sufficiently large time scale, to establish some general patterns of ideological entailment for every philosophical model, or in other words, to work out a basic system of ideological symptomatology. Some philosophies over time turn out consistently to lend themselves more readily to radical emancipatory projects. Others feed mostly reactionary backlashes. Still others mostly appeal to romantic dandies, and so on. Now, if we go back to Feuerbachian philosophy, the most distinct thing about its ideological functionality pattern, I think, is that it has not really changed that much over the last 150 years. On its surface, the Feuerbachian discourse uses the language of humanism, alienation, false necessity, and empowerment. Concepts and tropes which in the contemporary ideological usage have come to be commonly treated and represented as inherently progressive. If we limit our examination of the Feuerbachian model to this surface level, and accept the terms of the debate set by the conventional wisdom in a more or less uncritical fashion, the most likely conclusion we are going to derive is that the effects of its incorporation into the modern international law project are generally quite progressive. But surface impressions, of course, are deceiving. If, instead of the apparent language, we look at the objective patterns of Feuerbach's political usage, I think we will see a completely different picture. Looking back at the last 150 years, I cannot think of any Feuerbachian thinker whose political practices favored a program advocating fundamental social change, a meaningful redistribution of power and welfare, a restructuring of the relations of cultural and economic production, or for that matter, any other program of active emancipatory politics. Come to think of it, every Feuerbachian trope I know, every time I saw it used, has been used only to reinforce the overall legitimacy of the contemporary social structure, that is to say, the existing class structure. Why? How? By what logic? The argument is complex, but its basic structure is not. If nowhere else, we can glimpse its bones in Louis Althusser's commentary on Feuerbach's concept of history. Just like in Feuerbach, the basic idea of history lodges itself between the individual and a species in order to fill the vacuum separating them, and thus transform the species into reality, which means, in fact, that history for Feuerbach is ultimately nothing but the concept of this vacuum. So too, in the eyes of the mainstream international law tradition, that which we must recognize as the actual enterprise of international law manifests itself not in fact in the positivity of its present normative institutional realization, but in that nebulous in-between which unfolds between this positivity and the hidden promise of universality. No challenge, no criticism thrown against the former can therefore ever translate in the eyes of the mainstream tradition into a valid challenge of international law itself. The cause is immune against all criticism precisely because it itself is constructed as an act of continuous self-transcendence, i.e. a critical negation of its present condition. But is it that really? Look closely. In Feuerbach, the language of self-transcendence may be implied, but what it covers up is an entirely different structural operation. The way forward is the way inward. Universality is the essence of international law. The more the enterprise of international law reveals itself to be nothing more than a promise of transforming its present imperfect condition by reverting to its inner perfect essence that is always already pre-programmed into its current materiality, the more solipsistic it becomes in its slippery vacuum. The plane of the international legal project, seen from within its own eyes, put differently, knows no concept of history, nor of dialectics, nor of alliator transformation, nor indeed of any need for a radical revolution. Its essence consists in nothing more than the act of self-becoming, with understanding that this self is always already carried within its fold. The end, in other words, is always already realized within the origin. Universality within the positivity of the existing legal order. The ought within the is. The utopia within the apology. The journey from one to the other is meant to be precisely what the enterprise of international law has come to exist for. And yet, if the end is always already present within the origin, then the journey must always already be completed. One only needs to be able to see that properly. That is to say, one only needs to learn to understand the history of the international legal project as a perfect contemporaneity of its origin and its telos. But a history so conceived, a history that is meant to realize itself through the perfect contemporaneity of its end and its beginning, is not really a history in any meaningful sense of the term. It is only an emanation of the divine omnipresence. The adoption of the Feuerbachian mode of thought into the latent, assumptive matrix of the mainstream international law tradition reinforces international law's contribution to the legitimation of the contemporary social structure. That is to say, the existing class structure. And the class structure which underlines the global political arena today, just as in the days of Ludwig Feuerbach, is pervasively dominated by the liberal bourgeois class. Its internal self-descriptions may have changed over time, as have the forms of its self-organization, but the heart of its logic remains the same. It is a fundamentally cosmopolitan class whose primary reason and precondition of existence lie in the maintenance of an all-pervasive regime of socio-economic exploitation rooted in the private ownership of the globally distributed means of production. And so, to dot all the remaining I's and to cross all the remaining T's, the fundamental ideological bias of the modern international law project, insofar as we can see it inscribed in the Allotting conception of international law, by its very structure is that of a liberal, bourgeois, hegemonic political enterprise. So what? Why does it matter? Who cares? Tempting as such questions may seem, they do not, I believe, point in the direction of the most fruitful inquiry at this stage. So let me replace them with a slightly different set of queries. After everything that has been said so far about Alice, Schmidt, and Feuerbach, even after that awkward diagnosis suggested by Marx and Engels in that other excerpt, the socialistic bourgeois who wants the proletariat to remain where it is but stop hating the bourgeoisie for that, where does all this leave us? You and me, as liberal people who believe in humanity, have an aspiration for universality. Where does this leave us with our beliefs and aspirations which have been ingrained into us as an integral part of our disciplinary reflexes? The aspirations which we have come to see as our own, personal, identity-defining values. Presuming the conclusions I have made above are correct, where does all this leave us as international lawyers? The answer I have to that question, I'm afraid, is nowhere nice. unless you are totally smitten by the liberal bourgeois version of shamefaced colonialism. The knowledge of all these facts, if you're a committed international law professional, leaves you nowhere nice, nowhere comfortable, nowhere peaceful, nowhere quiet. And the worst of all, there's no way you can just sit through this. Writing about Hegel's ontological theory, and by implication therefore about Feuerbach, Althusser famously observed once that the whole of the Hegelian philosophy of history is based in principle on the possibility of reducing the full totality of a historically given society to a simple internal principle, which constitutes the essence of that historical period. A possibility that can only make sense on the absolute precondition of relegating the whole infinity of concrete social life to the status of a pale epiphenomenal externalization or ruse of some grandiose metahistorical ghost. The dogma of the modern international law project assigns the condition of universality the place of the same hidden internal principle encoded into the structure of the existing international legal order. The problem with this analytical operation, however, is that this structure is not, in its ontological foundation, a transcendental abstraction. It is the product of a very concrete, even at times tremendously complicated to account for, combination of social factors, a combination which is entirely historical and thus entirely temporal and this worldly. Failing to recognize this crucial aspect, the scholars who follow the general theoretical thrust of the dominant dogma, even when acting in good faith and with the best possible intentions, inevitably lock themselves into the discussion of an essentially false problematic. What the basic implications of that are ought not to be difficult to discuss. The further we go down that route, the more we become compelled not only to mystify our account of the dynamics of international law project, but also to fetishize its concept of universality, misrepresenting both of them to external audiences, but also to ourselves. The more the effect that this has on our social cultural field become ever more grandiose. We acquire our professional identities in a field that is fervently bourgeois and colonialist to its tiniest fiber. It is bourgeois and colonialist, not just in the sense of its immediate substantive value preference, its pahoro, but in its very fundamental thought structure, its langue, its productive mechanism. We emerge into a discipline which has always already made our most fundamental political choices for us. It equips us with the skills, aspirations, and motivations we need in order to advance the bourgeois project of capitalist colonialism. And it teaches us not to know any other way to have a professional discursive life. The more uneasy we become with such prospects, the more uncomfortable we find them, the faster we start to realize that we have to stop trusting our own best instincts, our own best reflexes if we are to find a way to overcome and rise above the limitations of our subject positions. But the practice of that realization comes at a very heavy intellectual and emotional cost. Naturally, the bourgeois colonialist hegemony over the international law field, like over any other intellectual field, can never be totalizing, all-reaching and absolute. There will always remain some residual space for disruptive maneuvers, defiance and resistance. The basic ideological subject positions into which we are molded by our professional experiences are never going to be as much of a Procrustean bed as my impression of them may have suggested. But to start celebrating that is a loser's prize. Fine, you get to score 1 goal. The other side, in the meantime, got to score 20. And what does that make you of your achievement? Fine, so you have an opportunity to throw in a little resistance act here and there. So what? The broader field against you is unambiguously tilted. The only way you can overturn that tilt is by refusing to play in the game altogether, by refusing to be pulled into the bourgeois universality games under whatever guise they are sold to you, by quitting, in other words, and walking away, surrendering without even a fight. The only way you can overturn is by giving up, by losing. Another alternative, and there is always, of course, another alternative, is to proceed nonetheless, but without trusting any of your own professional instincts, to question every one of your acquired reflexes, however innocent they may seem. Every habit of thought, every political value, every ethical default which pulls you in that direction or this. And that's a good thing. But an exercise of such magnitude and intensity is inevitably going to be a drain on every limited resource that you have. Wherever you will manage to progress, you will have to do that at little more than a snail's pace. And moving slowly will not just have a detrimental impact on your capacity for political struggle. In most cases, it will mean losing the fight before it began. So once again, you find yourself in a losing position. And that is before you even get to the question. What makes you think that the activity of self-questioning would actually be a viable solution in the first place? Think again. That too is a hallmark of Feuerbachian bourgeois liberalism. And so to conclude, with all this behind us, arriving to the end, what are we left with? The answer I want to give to you is essentially twofold, or rather, if you will, it is essentially two separate and somewhat different answers, but I like to think of them as one. The first answer is that the liberation of the international law project from its untamable drive for oppression and colonialism can only be accomplished in the same measure in which the basic dynamics of the global socio-economic intercourse is brought to lose its essential class character. Another way of putting this would be to say, together with China and Yedel, but not for the same reasons, that to make the dynamics of the international law project genuinely universalist, it would be necessary not just to reform the institutions of international law or the thinking of its rank and file professionals, but to alter radically the very form in which it operates today. Failing that, what we are going to be left with is just an endless slide into the same Feuerbachian rabbit hole towards the same capitalist, colonialist, genocide, whitewashing politics that has accompanied the reality of the international law profession over the last 2 centuries. The second, much more disheartening answer is it looks as though this rabbit hole is actually all we have. No matter how hard we may try, the enterprise of international law will always, of necessity, resolve itself into a constant deferral of its universalist promise. And to repeat Arthur Leff's move, given what we know about the unresignable links between such deferrals and the legitimation of colonialism, one must admit this is a rather unappetizing prospect. Neither reason, nor caution, nor critique can point us a way out of this paradox. What is more, there is no reason why any of them should. A system of international legal rules and institutions that would embody a truly universal human condition is no less inconceivable in theory than it is unachievable in practice. Only if the international law profession could somehow get over its neurotic obsession with universalism could its discourses and practices begin to move away from legitimizing colonialism. The achievement of this condition, however, requires not only the realization of a practical agenda that seems completely beyond our reach today, it also requires putting to rest the whole enterprise of international law, as we know it. For indeed, if there's anything we should have learned from Andy today, or even Alec for that matter, it is certainly that the unstoppable drive to advance the business of global oppression constitutes an integral structural element of the international legal form itself. It is encoded into it as a historical phenomenon and as a modality of governance. If we want to end international law support for colonialism, we must end the international legal form itself. How that can be achieved, I do not know. What is more, I frankly doubt it can even be tried before the capitalist mode of production is brought to an end in all its countless variations and disguises. Until then, I'm afraid, I won't be able to give you any easy answers. Except that Arthur Leff was probably right. Napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting, Hitler, Stalin, Hammond, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned salvation. Those who acquiesced deserve to be damned. There is no such a thing as evil, and legal discourses do take place in a field of pain and death. I'm reminded at this stage of Pierre Schleck's comment. The therapy is terminated. The patient stands up ready to leave. She comes to the door, opens it, walks through, and departs from our side, stepping into a world without neuroses, but also probably without germs. Probably. I do not like, I must confess, this medical metaphor which Schlein used in the last excerpt in the handout. The idea of treating theoretical questioning as some kind of extended psychotherapy sessions sounds at best a little pretentious. But however imperfect the metaphor may be, I ask you to entertain it, if only for a while. Because if what I think it seems to suggest is in any way true, then that is the real scandal of which we should start speaking today. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we go through a series of questions, just moderate questions instead of questions just going up to Akbar. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions? So why don't we start right at the front and walk back?
Okay, if I understood correctly, if the aspiring of universality by international lawyers is something that necessarily leads to this sort of a terrible world we have of colonialism, then renouncing to it, if we are claiming that it is impossible to renounce to it, exactly where does that lead us? You said nowhere nice, but I didn't find a very good description of what that place might even look like.
It's nowhere nice in the sense that, in very reductionist terms, without getting rid of the aspiration for universality, we won't get rid of international law's unstoppable slide into legitimizing colonialism. To get rid of the aspiration for universality, however, would mean to put an end to the enterprise of international law as we know it. Because the enterprise of international law as we know it exists in that nebulous in between the positivity of the existing legal materials and the promise of universality. It is impossible to put an end to the enterprise of international law until after capitalist mode of production is brought to an end. So that is why the task that stands before those who are unhappy with colonialist nature of international law is so daunting.
So basically, international lawyers are, if they want to end this kind of depression, they have to quit the international law project altogether.
No,
No.
that won't help. Somebody else will continue the project. The only condition under which international law's contribution to colonialism will end is when, and this will not sound particularly insightful if we put it like that, but this is the ultimate, I guess, denominator behind all of these equations. The only condition under which international contribution to colonialism will end is when capitalist mode of production is brought to an end. What that will lead us to is, I don't even know what it will look like. I don't think it's possible, even in theory, to conceive of that from where we stand. I'm not sure if it's possible to reach that land in practice, but I'm quite confident that in theory we can't even reach there with our thought today. Did that help?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you destroy the international law project after you destroy capitalism. That would be the idea.
No, it's
The
not
thing we call international legal form will not exist then. So the only way international legal form can end is if capitalism ends. But come on, ending capitalism is not the kind of thing you do on the weekend.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we go Tanya and then we go Mary? Yeah?
No, I was just going to say something in regards to what Alfonso was saying. I think the point is it's not about destroying international law. It's that the foundations upon which international law is based, makes it impossible for it to be universal. So, and this foundation are reinforced by the present economic situation that we're in, the capitalist situation. So, if this unequal relationship should end, then we can have a new structure, because as Angus said in the article we read for John's class, the whole idea of international law could be traced back to colonial days, and as you said, civilization. And after colonialism, developing countries I mean, if you look at the stages at which developing countries came to play a role in international law, that itself explains the differences in the structure, because they were forced to participate first through trusteeship, and then later they were given the illusion of sovereignty to participate as equal in a system which they had no say and no input. And that's the state of the system up to now in modern days. So unless that differences, that inequality that is broken down, like there's no form of universality in my opinion.
The unattainability of universality is part of the very structural design of international legal form, not just substance of various international legal regimes.
Tony?
Yeah, when we're talking about international law universality, you pay too much attention to international lawyers, because like international law as we know it now, like modern international law, was created by politicians, like namely but the politicians are from two countries, like I don't know names, but the UK and the US. So, and like it's highly politicized still, and like politics always smells, and it smells bad. So like, well, what I'm trying to say is that when we're talking about international law, we shouldn't talk about like the role of lawyers, because as lawyers we're just servants.
So I think I disagree insofar, and I agree insofar as there's a conceptual slippage here. That which is created by politicians, let's use that phrase for now, is the totality of substantive bargains that are entrenched in the form of international legal rules. The conceptual object that I try to represent under the rubric of the enterprise of international law is not what politicians say bargain, it's disciplinary enterprise. It is what the international legal profession does when it speaks about these rules, when it conceptualizes these rules, when it organizes these rules, or when it figures out the place of these rules in the law. If we remove the international legal profession, if we remove the enterprise of international law mentally from the picture, the rules, the bargains that were struck by politicians would still remain. Whether those bargains would have the power that they currently have, I strongly doubt. I think a large part of the quote-unquote political power of politics comes from the fact that it is carried out within the legal framework. And the legal framework itself is the product of, it's an object effect created by the discourse of the legal profession.
So you still insist on the idea that like international law was, like the framework, the legal framework was produced by lawyers. So, and it's supposed to be objective then, not subjective.
What do you mean?
I mean, like, well, if it's purely legal, like, okay, let's talk about the legal framework as you mentioned it. Like, if it's purely legal, then it's supposed to be objective rather than subjective. But what we have now is like, international law is highly subjective. Think where it is.
What do you mean by it?
Because, well, because we have lots of, like, okay, you were talking about humanity. You were talking about like crimes against humanity. What we got in Iraq, there was crimes against humanity.
That's what you think.
This is what, well, it's not like what I'm thinking about. It's like when you compare two different situations, like let's say Kosovo, what we got in Kosovo and what we got in Iraq, and what we got like, we're talking about war crimes and all this stuff. So, and then when we were talking about Pinochet and like the principle of universality in criminal law, and then when we end up with the Iraqi situation, so like nothing happens.
And that is precisely a sign that the legal system works objectively and predictably as
Yes.
people expect it to work. So it's still objective.
It's not objective.
Why not? You don't like the outcome, but that's not a sign that the outcome is not pre-programmed into the legal system. The legal system does not consist of rights and duties.
No, the legal system, that is that the legal system doesn't work.
No, it works. It works precisely by not giving you the outcome you
Well,
want.
it serves now, then it serves to them who pay for this.
Okay. The basic point that the basic point we're focusing on now is the conceptual split between rights and privileges in the Hochfeldian framework. You seem to assume that the world of use ad bellum, the use of force, is a world of rights and duties, and very strictly prescribed rights and duties that are self-executable and have a remedial structure reminiscent of a domestic legal system. Now that is in itself obviously something we can discuss, but the real issue here is that the questions relating to the use of force in international law are traditionally couched in the shape of Hochfeldian privileges. And the basic idea about Hochfeldian privileges is that they are territories of discretion. And territories of discretion suggest that if the privilege holder decides to exercise a particular privilege, then things will go one way. If they decide not to exercise, things will go another way. The interesting thing to remember is that regardless of how the privilege holder exercises their discretion, if they exercise the discretion within the limits of the privilege, the counterparts are in a position of no right, or as John Collins called, exposure, so they must put up with it. Or in other words, the legal system has worked insofar as it prevented anyone from being able to do anything about the privilege holder's exercise or non-exercise of the privilege in question. Which was now the question, was there a privilege to intervene in Iraq or was there not? And that is the question, how do we establish what the law on the use of force is? Do we look at the law in the books or do we look at the law in the action? Now my argument is that it has always been law in action in the last 70 years, and those who tell you otherwise should probably go and learn Ehrlich again, study Ehrlich again. It has always been law in action that superpowers for the last 70 years had the right for hegemonic intervention, which they use all the time. So it's not like there was anything new happening in Iraq in 2003. The legal system operated the way it operated for the last 70 years. There was an exercise of discretion.
Yes, but well, it was 7 years ago. It was like when there was no charter of the United Nations. But under the chapter 7, like it was, I don't know, articles 30 or 42 and 52. We have only two reasons
So
to intervene.
you're looking at the law in the books. I'm saying it's not law in the books that matters, it's law in action.
Well, that's the point. This is what they do. They don't look at they don't look at the law at all.
They do. Law in action.
Yeah.
It's not law in the books. Law in the books doesn't matter.
And okay. And this how to justify the intervention to Iraq.
We don't justify it. We explain the legal dynamic that exists in so many different areas of, the concept of law in action was not developed by international lawyers, so don't blame it on my profession. It was developed by commercial lawyers, it was developed by Roscoe Pound, it was developed by Eugen Ehrlich, who was a historian. It was
See, commercial lawyers who got an order from politicians.
That's an excessively conspiratorial view of reality. It also tends to credit with these fairly ridiculous group of people with far too much importance. We're talking about traffic accident lawyers. We're not talking about dudes who represent Enron. Traffic accident lawyers will not be bought by politicians to, you know what? From now on, just let's ignore this provision of the code. If the ignoring the provision happens, as Ehrlich would say, it's because this is quote unquote the living law as it exists outside the legal document.
Let's carry that on. Another way of saying it's just that within any of the provisions is already contained its exception or the way to derogate it. So you can always find a legal justification to do whatever you want, it seems, right? So it's in the law already. I have a question for you. I'm just going to take fiat for a second, right, and be dictatorial. So I have a question that I'd like to end on. But here, if you answer, and then we can go up and have pizza. And I want to take up something that was like,
So the answer would be, yeah, I never thought about that.
No, like just for 1 minute, right? So here's my question for you, is that you seem to say that universalism is this bad thing, and why it's bad is that it refers to some sort of perfect essence, which is the common humanity. And that common humanity is a false consciousness that if we actually what we should really do is read class into that common humanity. So international law always justifies itself on the basis of having some sort of appeal to common humanity it's going to, but actually, we all know that's fake. Really, it's class. Let's do class. So, first question for you is, and you say things like the neurotic conception of universality. So it's like a figment of our imagination, a fetish. If only we could get to the authentic or the real. So to what degree does your call for class, if I understand that, just reproduce a call to understand the essential, right? Number one. And there it would be really interesting to hear your talk about the idea of the public in the private and how you would differentiate different sort of universalism, right? So I think you are arguing for a class universalism. And then, so secondly, so the culprit's not universalism, the culprit is the common humanity that hides. Okay, and then the other question I have for you is what Alfonso brought up, is that you make a claim that any system, you say that the system is in a constant state of deferral, so the promise always is deferred, and that's part of the universalist thing, and this is bad. But then you say, well, then we fall into this Nietzschean trap that Alfonso said, like, well, what do we do? And you say, well, I don't know, right? It seems daunting. But my question back for you is, one thing you could think about how liberal cosmopolitan international law works today is that they say, even if it's not happening, we think it can happen. And the basis of us saying it can happen is good enough for us to try. So I wonder if that's not the nature of any radical political project.
So, okay, I almost forgot the first question by the way.
Sorry.
To what extent was this call to look out for pernicious influence of Feuerbach, it's all Feuerbach? Yes. Towards the end, isn't it true that this very culture of self-examination and self-questioning itself a hallmark of Feuerbachian liberalism? So it is, if we want to think of it in these terms, a case of reason folding upon itself. We realize that we don't like something about the reason of in international law, the international law reason, and as we slowly pull the thread, we realize that the way we approach this dislike itself part of the thing that we dislike. So it's the intellectual reflexes which we feel uncomfortable with, we feel uncomfortable about them through the use of those very same intellectual reflexes. I don't know if that made sense. With regard to the second question, it sounds to me like basically, so against the background of all this, shouldn't we just try the Pascal wager?
So explain what you're thinking.
So you were saying towards the end, liberal cosmopolitans would say, it wouldn't hurt to try. If we succeed, if we try and we don't succeed, then it's no big deal. If we don't try, whereas we could have succeeded, then it's a big deal. And that sounds exactly like the Pascal wager in instruction. Pascal wager is, if God does not exist and we believe in him, it's actually okay. It doesn't cost us anything. And if God does exist but we don't believe in him, then we're going to be severely punished. So between these two options, it's safer always in a state of uncertainty to believe in God. That's the Pascal wager. And the Pascal wager is very popular. You're like, well, I don't know, so I'll just go to the safer thing. It's cheaper, isn't it? Cost effective. And it's absolute nonsense if you do economics. It's absolute nonsense insofar as it ultimately discounts loss opportunity cost. Because it presumes that believing in God when God does not exist is costless. And the reality, of course, is not, because by investing your belief in a God-like figure, you have committed yourself on the belief front, thus have diverted your belief resources from other usages. And also loss opportunity costs. Loss opportunity costs can be really heavy. So the presumed equation is not nearly as straightforward. It's not like believing is zero and not believing is potentially very negative. both things are potentially very negative. So it's not like if we try and we fail, well, it's 0. And if we didn't try and we could have succeeded, then it's a very big potential negative. In both cases, you have potential negatives. The cloud of uncertainty goes in both directions. Oh, there's somebody walking next door. Okay, I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, why don't we keep it going upstairs? We have lots of food upstairs.
Yes.
Let's go eat and drink.
Okay.